folks who not only are deeply versed in the real politics of raising food from the ground up, who also
Are you filming at the moment?
How that fits in terms of the context of things. So one of the things I think I would like to do today is maybe devote the last quarter hour or half an hour to an overview of why what we're doing is so significant and important, and to sort of put your efforts and ambitions in a context, a larger context, so you can actually perhaps develop a keener sense of why raising food through fall and winters is a foundational step in terms of supporting local culture's ability to press on through the decades for its sustainable, regenerative, healthy, as distinct from the dead end of hyper-capitalism that's being forced down our throats through conventional soup.
Maybe it's both at the same time.
Yeah. Are you going to cover any perennial systems that overwinter well when produce yields?
Yeah, I think that would be probably.
Okay, here we go. Much better.
We'll see where the flow goes. I mean, we generally find that we can talk for days on this topic. So what I'll tend to do, particularly around questioning, is that if a lot of questions come in, say, maybe we won't touch.
Maybe we won't address that topic now, but we can talk about it later. The fundamental focus here today is going to be on raising vegetables through the course of fall and winter. Okay, I think we've got about 5 minutes until official cyberspace kickoff. Oh yeah. Oh sure. It's actually on my Facebook timeline. It's Nick Routledge, and it'll be archived there, so you'll be able to get to it later. No need to sort of rush or panic in that regard. Alexander over here is doing the live feed, and I don't know, is this video too?
Yeah.
So we might actually have higher quality video as well as that going on, so at the end of the day I think we'll probably have something useful up online.
Does everyone else have access to your Facebook feed?
I'm public.
Okay. Nick Routledge? Routledge in Eugene?
Rout as in Brussels sprout.
A grand British name, if I ever heard one.
Okay, so what do we introduce ourselves?
Well, let's give ourselves another couple of minutes to do that. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to start just by explaining what we have here, because that's less interesting to the other people. We brought a bunch of materials, including all these charts, which all have slightly different information, which is good to compare and contrast. But also brought some books that anyone can come and look at. They're my books, so don't walk away with them. And I do use them. So we have the Eliot Coleman books, which are very classic winter gardening books in the Northeast. Four Season Harvest has a lot of information on there. And the Winter Harvest Handbook. It has a little bit more of like a professional grower angle to it, which is really helpful to even apply it on a gardening scale, because he's kind of a small scale grower. Some of that information isn't as applicable here, but it tends to be okay, because in the Northeast they have a lot of light all winter long, but it's really cold. Where here we have very little light from the clouds, but then it's not as cold. So it's an interesting difference.
And we also have much more in the way of dampness.
Yeah, a lot wetter.
Yeah.
So another book, Binda Colebrook, Winter Gardening in the Maritime Northwest. This is a classic in this area. She's up in BC, I believe.
It was written, I think, about maybe 35 years ago, and is considerably out of date, but it's sort of remained the classic in its field for a long time. It was the only text we had in the Pacific Northwest. I don't know if they've updated the varietal information, but most of the varieties she used to talk about have long disappeared from the catalogs.
Yeah, this new version is the 5th edition, so it came out very recently. There's less variety information in there because she realized that it's so ephemeral because of the seed market. but there is some really good information in there nonetheless. And if you find an old version, sometimes you can track down those varieties. We actually try to carry some of those varieties because no one else is, but she's got a lot of good information. Very kind of well-rounded, basic, like gardener, like from that perspective. A lot of this information isn't particularly applicable to like the small scale or vegetable grower, but there's some interesting information. Binda Colebrook, winter gardening in the maritime Northwest. There's a couple other books I brought that are interesting that I flipped through that have great information, but I haven't systematically gone through it to figure out. But this one is Charles Downing, Winter Vegetables. This is a British kind of perspective. He's in, I think he's in southern England, so like in Somerset. So this has a really interesting, like, we have a very similar climate to what they do over there. So a lot of this might seem like it's not applicable, but it is. Some of the vegetable varieties in here are hard to get here. They're more English varieties, but it's good information too. And a new book that I just picked up from a more local author, Bill Thornless. He wrote Cool Season Gardener. Very interesting new perspective, but it's also more of the gardener scale stuff. So the reason why I bring all this stuff up is to say, like, winter cropping is very complicated and there's so much to know. It seems like there's more to know than just summer gardening, but you don't have to dig into all of this and get overwhelmed, but you can cherry pick and, collect the knowledge slowly over time if you're new to it. So don't feel overwhelmed, just dive into one thing, or you can go super crazy deep too. There's a loghouse plants chart, a winter gardening chart, which is in color. It's very pretty. I printed off some West Coast Seeds winter charts, which is up in Vancouver area in British Columbia. Territorial also has a winter gardening chart. Those are fun to compare because Territorial started with a very intense winter gardening focus in the Pacific Northwest. They've expanded since then to cover a lot of other things, but they still have that strength. A lot of the varieties that they used to carry are hard to get commercially, so they don't have a lot of the really, really winter hardy varieties, but they do have some. So, or Castle Franco chicory or sugarloaf. But if you plant them in June, some of those varieties will bolt because they were just planted 2 weeks too soon. But you plant them a little bit later into July, they won't bolt and they'll size up perfectly. So it's kind of like, I like to think of it in seed saving is the same way for me as is in plant timing and cropping. Think of it as a recipe that you're trying to develop on the fly, but also follow your previous recipes. Like, it's just like baking a cake that you're trying to maybe adapt next time. But each, like, you're baking a cake, you're not baking brownies. That's like the difference between brassicas and chicories. They're different animals.
And you'll have heard me speaking in very absolutist terms about brassicas being the backbone of the winter garden and as needing to get these transplants in the ground in the next 2 weeks, ideally. But there's still a vast array of crops that there's still plenty of time to seed. The winter, what we call the sort of the saladier plants, the spinaches, the Asians and the European greens. Particularly if you're looking to put plants under cover, for example. If you're still wanting to seed, there's still plenty of time to do a lot with crops as of yet. That brings us back essentially to these two major sort of transplant windows. Well, as you could say, three. The leeks go in super early, the Brussels sprouts tend to come in first, then we come in with particularly the fall brassicas. Fall brassicas, we tend not to... It's interesting to me that they tend not to be talked about too much. Broccoli, for example, excels as a fall crop in our bioregion in October, November, December. It's absolutely superb. A couple of reasons for that. A lot of gardeners find that it can be very finicky for them in the spring. It's not uncommon, for example, for local organic farms to do succession sowing 3 or 4 rounds of brassicas and for 1 or 2 of them not to work out. They'll have a tendency to bolt, particularly as our spring and summer conditions are getting more erratic. We're consistently seeing these. We tend to, for example, think about climate chaos in terms of these long trends and sort of shifts in temperature over long periods of time. But one of the things we're really noticing is the fact that what we're seeing is more in the way of erratic weather conditions. So you might get, a temperature spike in early spring going up into the high 90s. A day in high 90s may not seem to bother you too much, but all your lettuces will bolt for a start. Maybe a whole bunch of your broccoli varieties will start to bolt. So one of the things that we find paradoxically in a sense is that sowing into the winter can afford us a little bit more certainty in some respects around the likelihood of, for example, broccolis to come off. You'll find that one of the reasons fallen broccolis are such a great idea is because the way plants protect themselves from the cold, essentially, is by pumping themselves essentially full of antifreeze, sugars. So you'll generally find fall and winter gardeners and farmers doing a little dance jig whenever the weather gets cold, because they know that everything is beginning to sweeten up. Kales taste great in the winters. If you've eaten kales before and not liked them, you've probably been eating them at the wrong time of the year. Through the fall and winter, everything begins to taste really quite exceptional.
Funny story about that. When we were running our CSA, we grew all the summer crops as well. So eggplant and melons and tomatoes and basil, all the good, amazing summer stuff. And we had a roommate at the time who was also, he worked in food systems, so he really understood some of the issues that we were dealing with. But halfway through summer, we were like just starting to harvest our watermelons. Like it was like amazingly bountiful, really tasty. He had been on our farm that previous winter, and midsummer, Spencer said, "I'm tired of summer vegetables. When are the brassicas and all these really tasty winter foods going to show up?" Because he realized that we actually had more crop diversity and variety and plant types going through our winter CSA than our summer CSA. And like the summer carrots are good, but that fall carrot that's gotten those cool nights is just amazingly delicious. And when the brassicas and the kales and all that stuff start to sweeten up, he was actually like, I can't wait for the winter vegetables in the middle of the summer bounty. So once you start seeing what's possible, it gets really exciting.
Coming back to culture, timing, so on and so forth. Before we kicked off today, you heard me talking a little bit about how gardeners in some senses have advantages over farmers in terms of the scale that we're working at, allowing us to be more particular and to sort of more micromanage our crops. Classic example of this was it 5 or 6 years ago? Temperatures got down to -10 in town. It was brutal. I mean, absolutely brutal cold snap. Smashed all records. We were 20 degrees colder than Portland. And as the weather was beginning to roll in on us, we had a sense that it was going to get cold. We didn't realize quite how cold. I'd never grown food into temperatures that cold in my life, so I put the word out to a local sort of Facebook community saying, does anybody out there have any experience carrying food through these sorts of temperatures? And I got a flurry of answers from people who'd basically grown food in the Midwest. And they basically said, give up. Throw the towel. Just stop. Give up. You're wasting your time.
Bury your cabbages in the mud.
Yeah. And but I thought, we'll see what goes on. Now, they were right in a sense in terms of Midwestern growing, because what they're used to are temperatures going down and staying down. That typically doesn't tend to happen for us. What tends to happen is temperatures will go down, and then they'll start to bounce back up again. And consistently what we find in terms of winter cropping is that your garden can take, I mean, we tend to lose certain plants. The high 20s, you'll begin to, well, you'll lose your fennels, for example, your fall fennels as soon as things start to freeze. And then you'll start to lose some of your very fragile greens in the mid-20s. Once you start getting into the high teens, you hit another layer. And then once you start getting into the low teens, another layer. And then once you start getting into single digits, another layer, so on and so forth. And you can stack your gardens in terms of the survivability. But what we typically find is that if you get temperatures slipping down and that they get very cold for a night, your garden will take a little bit of a thumping. But generally, a lot of the times, it can get through a night. 2 nights in a row, a little more challenging. 3 nights, and you'll start to see a lot of 3 nights, for example, in the mid to high teens, and your garden will begin to take a real pummeling. 4 to 5 nights in all, and you're really looking at some severe damage. But going back to that minus 10 degrees, one of the sort of mantras that I've been really putting forth for years is that don't wait to set up your tools to protect your winter crops. Generally, if a severe cold front comes in, it comes in fast. Okay, so you're going to be wanting to be able to, for example, cloche your plants if you don't have protection over them already, which basically means having, for example, the tools and pieces ready to set up a cloche over your plants, to put plastic over it, and so on and so forth. That's not something you want to be having to scurry around at 6 o'clock at night at Jerry's trying to gather the material and put it together in the darkness, because temperatures are coming in that night. If you have that material ready to hand, you can put it out and protect your crops. And we were essentially able, I mean, I had one of my sort of $500 growing tunnels that we've sort of become, these cheap and cheerful growing tunnels that we've put up. You can grow probably, you'd say, 30 feet by 9 feet covered. You can put one of those tunnels together for $400 or $500. And then with a few other protection measures, for example, if we get heavy snowfall, you can stick T-posts underneath the rebar curves and basically carry greenhouses through, these funky little greenhouses through that crush a lot of the commercial, larger commercial greenhouses, for example. Using very, very, very low-tech approaches, we're basically able to carry a greenhouse full of winter greens through minus 10 degree temperatures and bring it out the other side. We're all local farms, so we're completely devastated. And that's salad greens. They tend to be less hardy than the brassicas, for example. So a classic example of how gardening, paradoxically, you tend not to think, in many ways, of course, the farmers are extraordinarily sophisticated. But when we work at this sort of small scale gardening level, we're actually afforded more room and more latitude, for example, to protect crops than a lot of the big guys are able to do.
One of the cloches and greenhouses and hoop houses are very, very helpful, and when you have one, you love it. But one of the simplest things you can do is get what they call a row cover, which is a spun polyester fabric that is designed for using on crops. Sometimes it goes by the name Remay or Agribond. Down to Earth probably sells it in smaller bits. So you can, instead of having to buy a 2,000 foot roll like we have to buy, you can just buy little pieces that you need. But what we realized is that can go a very long way to protecting your crops or keeping them to survive, so then in a month they'll regrow and feed you. They might still look like goo and nasty for a month, but that little bit of extra cover can help them survive into the spring when the temperatures go up. When the hard freeze was coming in, in the wintertime, we are checking our weather webpage or weather app, usually Weather Underground, every day to see what they're predicting the low's going to be, and remembering what the previous lows of the week were, so maybe they might be slightly wrong. We'll buffer and be a little bit more careful. But when you see a 10 degree snap coming in a week from now, we start taking that very seriously, and we make sure we have enough row cover when that a lot of people got down to 0 in town. We got down to 5. We just put 3 layers of row cover over our cabbage and our kale. And a week later, when it thawed out, we pulled it off. It was just like it was covered in a blanket of snow. Like underneath there, it might be 10 degrees outside or 5 degrees, but underneath there it sticks around like 25, 30 because of that thermal mass from the earth kind of warming it up. And that's a really, really cheap way of dealing with it. It doesn't solve every problem. Sometimes you create kites that fly off to the next county, but it's worth it, and I think that every gardener that's going to do winter gardening, start with row cover. If you don't use row cover, you are missing like half of what what's the potential out there. And also, it's actually here.
So
It's a different topic.
yeah. So a good segue to what we're really looking to do in terms of create a sort of a garden that balances edibility and survivability. You would have heard Andrew speaking a little bit before, saying we know certain crops are going to go down at certain temperature levels, for example. And then within particular crop types, let's talk about kales. Kales excite Andrew and I. With kales, for example, we know that certain kales are far hardier than others. So typically, for example, I'll throw, I don't know, these days not too many, I'll throw maybe 8 or 9 varieties of kales into a winter garden. And I do that for a variety of reasons. Diversity, we're finding, is not only a great idea in terms of tastes and flavors and so on and so forth, but in terms of crop types. You'll find that, as I was saying, different crop types tend to succumb at different levels. Different crop types tend to have a capacity to photosynthesize more effectively at less than optimal levels. When Andrew and Sarah went over to Europe in 2006, 2007, one of the crop types they brought back and essentially redefined cropping in our bioregion were rutabaga. They brought back rutabaga genetics. Up until that time, the rutabaga varieties that were commonly available to gardeners was very, very limited indeed. They brought back some new material from Europe. We started growing it out, and we found out that not only is it incredibly hardy, but they have a better capacity than many vegetables to actually thrive through winters. One of the things we're looking to do is find crop types and varieties that don't just stagger on through to the other side of winter, but actually thrive. And when we look at rutabagas, for example, one of the things we see about rutabagas is that what rutabagas are telling us is that we should be making them a cornerstone of our local diet, because they work, they're functional, they like it here, they're great. It's a classic example of how when you move into actually taking responsibility for feeding yourself and engaging with local climate, engaging with the reality of local soils and local trends, the message comes back from creation itself. Your diet begins to get steered. Your life begins to get steered by this feedback loop. So you start to incorporate more of these sturdy, vital vegetables. And the nutrient density of rutabagas are astonishing. I mean, you drop one on your foot, you'll break a bone. I mean, they are amazing, amazing, amazing creatures. So in terms of kales, we like kales. One of the reasons we like kales, they have a very economical habit. They grow up right. You can harvest off them repeatedly. They're very forgiving of fertility requirements. A lot of them will handle montane soils far better than many of the other brassicas. You'll find certain brassicas like cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, cauliflowers, classic examples. If you don't have a balanced fertility, they tend not to do too well for you. Kales far, far more forgiving. We also have a fair amount in terms of maturity spreads. There's a certain class of kales called hunger gap kales, and we'll have Andrew speak to it once I hand the microphone back to him. A different sort of maturity spreads that we have in that mix. And then also, if you think you know kales, think again. There's a vast diversity of flavors and colors and textures that has emerged in recent years. Gorgeous pink ribbed kales and purple ribbed kales that are coming out. You can make beautiful bouquets from kale leaves in the winter. You have 4 or 5 or 6 of different varieties in the garden. And of course, it's one of the most nutritious of all vegetables. So if you're beginning to consider which plants, which crop types you want to make a cornerstone of your garden, the very first thing we typically point people at are kales. Enormous diversity in terms of survivability, maturity, tastes, forgiving nature, and so on and so forth. And we have a bunch here today that you can probably take a look at.
Kale is one of our big things that we love to focus on for many of those reasons. I've actually gotten a little bit more excited about cabbage the past few years because I spent too many winters filling hundreds of boxes of kale and freezing my fingers off because you have to like bunch the kale and it's really cold. But cabbage, you just lop the head off and throw it in a box and call it good. It's amazing. But that's a farmer's perspective. But the kale diversity that's out there is really interesting because you can plant most kales and most of them will do great. But some of them do phenomenally well in different circumstances. So the two kales that we have, one is called Western Front, one is called Russian Hunger Gap. They look very similar. If you know them really well and you're a super plant geek, you can probably tell that one is slightly more curlier than the other, one has a little bit broader leaf, but that's not the real difference. The difference is Western Front was bred in southern Oregon, central western Oregon, and it was bred to survive mountain temperatures, so it will take a beating and then regrow later. But what it does is similar to the variety White Russian bred in Philomath by Frank Morton. They put on a ton of food in the fall and then they go dormant. They're like, oh, the refrigerator's here, I'm going to sit here and not do anything for 3 months. And then in the spring they go crazy. That dormancy where they stop growing seems to help them survive the cold temperatures. It helps them survive wet feet and flooding a little bit better through the winter, but they don't produce that many new leaves through the winter. Russian Hunger Gap is unique because it's not quite as winter hardy. It will die a little bit sooner, but usually it doesn't die because we don't get that cold normally, so it's okay. But it never goes dormant. It just keeps pumping leaves out. It just keeps pumping out leaves, pumping out leaves, pumping out leaves. But because it's actively growing all winter long, it can be a little bit more susceptible to that cold snap. The reason why they call it Hunger Gap at the end of the name is because it will actually wait 2 to 3 weeks later than other kales to bolt and flower. So that gives you a little bit more harvest window.
A lot at that time.
A lot at that time of year. But the most important part is it produces a ton of kale rob shoots, the little broccolis. And it will feed you for a month longer than other kales. So if you like that in the spring, you would plant something like White Russian, which will go through, or Western Front, and bolt a little bit early, but produce a ton of food early in the spring, and then be done, but then have your extra rob going through spring later into the season. And knowing that like the rob that comes up from the kale, those little broccolis, is like one of the most important parts of the food production of kale that we hardly ever realize. Probably 5 years ago you couldn't even get it at the farmer's market. And maybe a couple times they would come in, but now it's a big thing because it's a lot of food and it's really tasty. But if you want a long harvest window of rob, you plant an early bolting kale, which may have other attributes that make it great, but it's a little bit early to bolt, and then have a later bolting Hunger Gap kale in addition. One of the ways that we've dealt with this overwhelming level of diversity that's possible is, as seed growers, we can only save seed on one variety at a time because they cross-pollinate with each other really easily. So, and we had 20 varieties of Oleracea kale from Europe that we brought back, and Nick trialed them all in his garden the year after we got back from Europe, and we're like, where are we going to find isolation gardens for all these 25 varieties of kale? Like we're never going to find any, like a professional seed grower sometimes doesn't succeed in growing seed crops, well, let alone like we tried to plant a bunch around town in different gardens, and some of them worked and some of them didn't. It was like we started calling the seed ambassadors all good half the time because seed crops would fail all over the place. And then Nick is growing 17 varieties of Oleracea kale in his garden, all in it was a pretty big plot, but it fed him and his friends all winter long. We just let them all flower together. I was like, just let them go. And Nick called it the Kale Coalition, and it's like this huge biodiversity like explosion. And it's kind of, I like to call it the rainbow chart of kale, because it's that diversity and that unique color and leaf shape is actually a plus. It makes a really unique looking bunch of kale. But you get so many different flavors and textures and colors that some of the plants will do better on one winter, and other plants in that population will do better on another winter. So you kind of hedge your bets and buffer the differences in each season to season. So
you guys basically save seed from all that cross-pollination, and then so that way your seed has a lot of genetic diversity?
yes. So instead of having that pedigree of one variety, it's like a population all crossbreeding every year. And every year it gets more resilient and more mixed up. But because of that, this might be a little bit nerdy, we noticed that some of the plants were a little bit better at making seed than others, and some of the plants like to impose their genetic traits on others more dominantly. So we started saving seed off of individual plants and then mixing them proportionally in the mix, just to make sure that we don't lose the deep red color, which is a little bit more recessive, or we don't, it doesn't all turn into lime green giant collard greens, which it seems to want to do, or the cross between lacinato kale and collards or broadleaf kale is an extremely vigorous cross. If we did nothing, we'd just be eating that all the time, which is fine, but we kind of want to maintain the diversity, so we're stewarding it to maintain its complexity, which is kind of counterintuitive, but it's kind of fun too.
And yes, of course it was fun and interesting to cross all those cows up, but that population has been continuing, is continuing to be intelligently stewarded. I know that Keegan's been out in Marcola Way, has been carried that population again for another selection this last winter. And one of the reasons the Kale Coalition is interesting is because, as I said, to my estimation, it adds probably another 4 to 5 degrees of survivability to our kale populations. I mean, it was astonishing. We had a crushing winter that came through, I don't know, temperatures, maybe it might have been 2010 or something. And that Kale Coalition population I had out in my garden at the Fupa County Youth Farm at the time, and all the genetics that I've been used to growing that come out of plant stews in the northwest, particularly the classic red Russian and the lacinato, which for years were the only two kales that you'd see locally, they all went down. Whereas these European kales that we brought in just basically brushed off the weather. That survivability, again, is something that we're aiming for. And again, you don't need to have it all worked out. If you put diversity into your gardens year after year after year, what you'll find, for example, is that certain varieties will begin to reveal themselves as regular, constant, happy standouts. So you'll say, all right, I'm going to settle in on this particular variety. It's got this wonderful combination of hardiness and taste and reliability. This is the one, this one, or these 2 or 3, I'm going to keep them. And then what you'll find is that all of a sudden one year they stop performing very well. Or you might get 2 years in a row where they don't do their thing. Each year you typically tend to find particular varieties will excel and others will tend not to. And it all depends on what the weather's doing, and we can't predict what the weather's going to be doing. So again, one of the things you're doing is stacking the bases in your favor. Diversity is a core way you can do that, particularly as weather conditions become more erratic. We're increasingly seeing that happening in terms of our fall and winter gardens. Things are getting a little weird weather-wise, you might have noticed. Certainly gardeners were some of the first to wake up to climate chaos for exactly that reason.
As seed stewards, which I encourage any of you that wants to be a seed saver and actually select your own variety, these populations, there's many companies that sell them, Wild Garden Kales, Wild Garden Seeds, Siskiyou Seeds, we sell a lot of populations. You can take those varieties, the individuals in that population that you like, remove all the ones you don't like, don't let them flower, and you'll be selecting for a particular collection of traits that you like. And you can take it just a little bit, like, oh, I think red kale is a little bit too bitter for me, I'm going to get rid of all the reds. Or, like, I only really like the big broadleaf because they're easier to harvest and a lot more food to put on the table. I don't really need the curly ones. Like, whatever your preferences are, you can select for that and get more and more of that trait every year. And you can take it into a pedigree, like a really specific, focused variety that is very uniform special traits that do great things for those special traits. Or you can leave it wild and chaotic if you want. It all depends on your goals. And that's why we like to let those varieties out. And for example, the Kale Coalition, we actually registered that and with the Open Source Seed Initiative because we want people to use it as a base for new plant breeding. And what the Open Source Seed Initiative is a pledge that says that by planting this variety, you pledge to not limit other people's ability to save seed and breed it and into the future. So it's like all you're doing is saying you're not going to patent it, you're not going to make it proprietary, you're just going to keep it open source derivatively into the future. Because we think that this diversity, maybe it's too much chaos for you in your garden and you want to breed your own variety. Like, we want to empower people to do that because that's where we're going to find what works and is what is most resilient in order to have more food and more success in our gardens. So kale is a great place to start. We don't need to focus on kale for the whole thing, but it's a good anecdote.
Yeah, so where do you start placing the emphasis in your garden? As I said, kales we generally recommend so forgiving, you can harvest off them repeatedly, so on and so forth. Where might you not go? Well, unless you're an experienced gardener, for example, and your fertility is reliable, and unless you've got plenty of space, I would say, for example, avoid the overwintering cauliflowers. They tend to be large plants. They tend to have a very spreading habit. This size. And you take up a lot of space. If you've got the space, great. Go with it.
It's the best thing ever.
It's the best thing ever. I mean, an overwintering cauliflower in April and May is one of the great sort of aristocratic vegetable events of the year, quite frankly.
It's like a giant fractal cashew that is like ready when there's no other food.
With your soils, you'll find that they'll speak to you and they'll tell you when you're abusing them, and you'll see that in terms of quality of the food and the plants that they produce. It becomes very visible very quickly.
When it comes to soil fertility, one of the most damaging plants that you can grow for soil fertility is brassicas. They have no known mycorrhizal associations. They tend to push other stuff out. Like they actually suppress the biological activity a little bit in the soil. Other things don't tend to grow well with them next to them, and then they pull a lot of nitrogen and a lot of phosphorus and a lot of sulfur out of the soil. So if half of what we suggest planting is brassicas, you need to really think about soil fertility and maintaining that quality, where you might want to cover crop, you might want to add more compost than you thought you needed. But really, things like phosphorus availability and sulfur availability and calcium content in your soil, those things tend to be more on the soil science side of things, but when you're growing something like brassicas a lot, that's the first point when you see, oh, I need to know what the soil wants, and I might need to think about the minerals that are in the soil too. So I don't like to talk about how adding minerals to the soil is what you need to do to get your plants to grow well. Adding minerals to your soil is what you need to do to get the biology to grow well when you're overcropping things. Because we tend to have low phosphorus and low sulfur in our soils in this area. Compost is really good for potassium, so if you're adding that, you tend to not need much potassium. Our soils have a fair amount of potassium in them anyways. But just know that when you're cropping that hard, you're almost like, it's almost like you're mining what the bacteria and the fungi want to give to your cabbage. But they both need it, so you want to think about how to not abuse your soil. One of the things we do is do soil tests. You can get $25 soil tests pretty easily and see what your calcium and your phosphorus levels are to know if you need to add more, like crab meal or gypsum or something else to help the soil stay balanced, so those your little microscopic friends are happy. Because if you don't give them what they want, they're going to leave. And wet, hard soil that has no cover on it, that has been just added a little bit of nitrogen and compost, that compost is going to get eaten up by that soil very quick. So you might want to think more about the little bit more advanced depth to soil fertility when it comes to especially brassicas, because that's the first point when you start to get bit by it, is the brassicas that love to pull it out. And it's important to know that a lot of the crops that we grow, a lot of these seed varieties, have been bred for high input fertility environments. They're not bred to grow in a place where you just add a little bit of compost every year. That's something that works for a while, but these plants are they're like best in class bred powerhouses that are bred to yield, and if you breed something to yield, you are pulling a lot out of that soil. So it's nice to think of that as your foundation. Something as simple as potassium. If your potassium is a little bit low, your plants might not grow as fast. High potassium helps your plants grow quicker. So if you're like super delayed in your planting window and you're low in potassium, you're walking uphill trying to get there quicker. It's like you might want to make sure your soil's good first. But as long as you're feeding something, that's better. I like to do a lot of cover cropping because we have a lot of ground that we can put an acre fallow for a year and let all that carbon build and let the fungi have that extra 12 months to really build up in the soil. Because if you're tilling every fall, the fungi tend to grow a little bit and then get knocked back. They grow a little bit, get knocked back, but if you give them that extra 6 months, they will transform your soil quality. It's really wonderful. But then we also like to do intercropping. So if we plant a field of cabbage, we try to get in there and sow some clover, because cabbage likes mud. And if it's raining really hard and you're washing away your soil, having a little bit of clover growing underneath is often really beneficial. But that's also a challenge for a lot of gardeners, because once clover really takes off and grows like crazy in the spring, it is really hard to work into the soil by hand. It is one of the toughest plants on the planet. So it's figuring out different little techniques is a process, and it really depends on your situation. But I think focusing on soil quality and then focusing on varieties is really the two keystones.
Okay. I don't know if there are any major topics you want to cover yet, or should we open it up to questions at this point?
Pretty set.
Okay. Let's open it up to any question. Yes.
So I've been growing year round for a lot of years, and I don't know how to actually collect my seed effectively. I pretty much just take the dead ones and shake it around, and they all grow. But I would really like to actually maybe do it properly. Could you give us some tips on that?
I'll just say I think we'd be delighted to check in with you about that a little later. It's a huge topic.
I'm sure.
And for the moment, we'll just keep stuff on the fall and winter. But let's check in. There's actually Andrew and Sarah have a free, extensive pamphlet they put out on the Seed Ambassadors website, a seed-saving pamphlet.
Oh, I'll check it out.
That'll give you basically everything you need to know to get 80% of the way there.
Seedambassadors.org. It's listed
I got
as
it. I wrote it down.
It's superb.
It's the seed-saving zine. It's
Yeah.
kind of like old,
Thank you for
There's a lot of information.
Thank you.
And I might also say that once you start to introduce seed saving into the year-round cropping mix, you're going to even further exhaust your soils if you're not careful, because you're going to have the plants in the ground even longer. So again, it's the way to go. It'll add a beautiful degree of complexity, and also call you further into that quality of reverence
I
that
mean,
you
I
need.
do it. I just don't do it in a proper way.
Yeah, we call that
Yeah.
we call that casual seed saving, which is perfectly fine. But if you want to become a seed steward, there's a lot of techniques that can really make it a lot better for what your goals might be. You pointed them.
Oh, not so much a question. I just wanted to say that one of my ones I always use for winter is Japanese turnip. It seems to work really well. Even when the white part of the turnip kind of explodes, the greens are always, they kind of taste really good and last through the freezings really well. It seems like it's easy.
So, this gentleman over here was talking about how well Japanese turnips work. Do you want to speak to the turnips and maybe even a little bit to Japanese varieties?
Yeah, sure. Japanese turnips, the most common one is Hakurai. It's a hybrid. It grows really fast and produces lots of leaves. Like European turnips tend to have really tough, hairy leaves, but the Japanese turnips tend to the leaves can be just as good as the roots. There are some open pollinated heritage varieties of Japanese turnips. Japan has had a very long history of plant breeding and doing really cool things for different particular seasons and climates. They're very sophisticated with their niches in their agricultural system. So when you find something, it might grow amazingly well for you in a very particular situation because they dialed it in. And turnips are one thing. They might not be the most hardy, but you might be able to find an older variety that might be a little bit less pretty, and a little bit more mustard flavor, but it might be hardier. So there's a lot of opportunities there. They have a long history of open pollinated varieties. Most of the new stuff out of Japan is hybrid because that's where most commercial plant breeding is going. But yeah, there's some really cool Asian-focused seed companies like Kitasawa in San Francisco. Evergreen Seed is down in Los Angeles, I believe. But there's some really cool stuff that's coming out of Japan and China, especially we don't know that much about it in our community as far as how it's used best or how it's grown best. So that's a really great excuse to try 10 things and see what works.
I have a quick question about weeds, what we call weeds. We last year got a lot of weed. It was pigweed, and when I read up on it, it was pretty bloody good for you. So is there any good source of what we class as weeds being actually edibles or medicinals? Any good reference point?
The question was, what are the weedy... well, I'm putting words in your mouth here, Mike. What are the weedy plants that work well for us through winter? We've got a few, actually, that work quite well through winter. Dandelion, of course, being the classic, and chickweed, of course, being phenomenal. Do people here know chickweed? Okay, it tends to volunteer in gardens, almost like a cover crop. Has this extraordinarily... to look at the plant, you'd think it would be one of the least hardy plants of all, but it's extraordinarily hardy. Very popular with local wise women as a medicinal, really sort of like dandelion. These weedy plants tends to annihilate the distinction between food and medicine. They're the two most important ones I can think of, but then we've got several others.
There's a lot of unique in like the specialty section of seed catalogs, oftentimes like a lot of greens and a lot of plants that are kind of borderline weeds in the garden, but are more like old-time things that people used to eat as a crop. So there's things like salad burnet, for example, is kind of a weed, but it also tastes pretty good and it's really hardy and it's perennial. And it has this little leaf, but it has like a nice cucumber flavor. And it'll volunteer and grow a little bit weedy in the garden, but not too bad. There's other things.
Purslane.
Purslane is something that's a little bit more of a summer crop because it tends to die in the summer. But there's a lot of crops out there that are kind of in that gray area between actual weeds and actual crops. And and a lot of those are the most hardy and the most nutrient dense foods you can grow. So if you want to experiment in that, I encourage it.
Yes.
On Asian grains, one plant has kind of fascinated me for a few years now, called Ashikawa. And I believe y'all use this area. It goes under all the oils. seed probably this year, but come next spring we start setting seed.
How to grow ashitaba, which is kind of a big celery angelica looking plant. Has a lot of medicinal